TNOU. So are you seeing, when I share my screen, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, Professor. Yes, Professor, you are able to see the screen.
Excellent, okay. Thank you. Okay, very good. Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you. Hang on. Okay, we're right to go?
Yes, Professor.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. I'm Professor Michael Sankey from Charles Darwin University here in Australia, where I'm the Director of Learning Futures and Lead Education Architect. Also, I'm Executive Member of the Australasian Council of Open Distance Learning, ACODE, which is an international body that covers Australia, New Zealand and the South Pacific. And I'm also a Community Fellow of the Australasian Society for Computers in Learning and Teaching. And it's my very great pleasure to be here today to talk with you. I'm going to go over a little bit of ground that some of the things you've already heard, but then I'm going to expand it to some other areas in relation to what we see happening with micro-credentials across Australia, New Zealand and the Commonwealth. But we do see that, particularly over the last 5 years, there's been a rapid change in this landscape. So I was working at RMIT University 8 years ago, and we were just introducing micro-credentials. Now that's only 8 years ago, and a lot of ground has been covered in that time, particularly around the flexible nature of them and the way we have conceived micro-credentials to take us forward. So I'm doing a very quick introduction to the way we see it here in terms of the way they've evolved, and then looking at some key features of micro-credentials and some of the characteristics of them. But first of all, I'll just give this little analogy. So if this jar was my professional life, my life as a learner, lifelong learner, and in that jar I had some work experience. I've got my first degree and my postgraduate degrees. That same jar could have other things in it as well. So not only has it got those degrees, but that same jar can fit in lots of smaller pieces of information and smaller qualifications as well. And all of a sudden, this myself and others can have much more within that jar. But what are micro-credentials? Well, they are, of course, digital certificates that represent that you've got some knowledge or some skills. On the right-hand side, here are some of our micro-credentials, which we've badged. And of course, they are, as we've already heard, bite-sized pieces of information, and they're awarded by institutions or professional bodies, or in some cases by some online platforms, and they're often displayed publicly in digital portfolios or in resumes and things like that. In the Australian context, a micro-credential is a certification of an assessed learning or competency. So it has to be assessed to be called a micro-credential. And often they're associated with digital badges, but they don't have to be. It could be a certificate, it could be something else, but it doesn't have to have a badge. A badge is something we apply to a micro-credential if we want to. So we trace it back through, the whole notion of micro-credentials goes right back to early certification programs, which I would have done when I was in my 20s and 30s, where I'd done that, before the digital era per se, where I got given a piece of paper that said I'd done a particular course. It might have been in project management or whatever it might have been. It might have been a vocational skill. And then they were usually awarded when I've done some coursework, I've done some assessment associated with that. But then we had the evolution of lynda.com, which was an online platform that had little certificates. Now they were formatively assessed, not summatively assessed, but once you passed one of these courses, you got a little certificate. It wasn't a micro-credential as such, but it was a certificate. We then had the open learning and open courseware systems developed in the UK and in the United States, and particularly with the advancements in the internet, and institutions started to be able to offer a lot more courses. We had the very early learning management systems and things like that. And we saw the first MOOC offered in 2007 by Utah State University. Then MIT opened their open courseware, and Khan Academy. They provided very early forms of micro-credentials, but not necessarily digitally badged. They were more certificates they offered, until the Mozilla Open Badge project started in about 2011. And then we started to see the foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, played a pivotal role in developing the badge scenario that could be shared and be validated. And that was a very important element, that it was validated against a particular body. And this allowed us, individuals, to issue, to earn, to issue and display our digital badges in a whole lot of different ways. Once that had happened, it opened the door for the growth in the online platforms like Coursera and edX and Udacity, who started much fuller online programs and nano degrees and micro-masters. And these platforms really pioneered this notion of micro-credentials, combining that with the online learning and the validation that happened of the skills of that online learning. So really from about just after 2010 to present, we've seen the demand for these skills really start to accelerate. So it's only about 14 years since that was, and so that now it's come to the place where it is highly acceptable to have an online qualification. But what are the different types? There are lots of different types of qualifications we can get, of micro-credentials that you can earn. And so there are the competency-based ones, and certificates and badges and nano degrees and master's degrees. There are industry-recognised certifications. We just heard in one of the previous presentations about the vocational ones as well. And so in looking across the educational sector, there are all these different forms of what some people are calling micro-credentials. And so from that early movement, we've seen that develop quite strongly. This isn't a bad thing, because it does need to, what we do need to understand that development as we move forward. So we actually put that in context. And these common types are still very present in the market today. And so we saw that micro-credentials move from this notion of credentials through to digital credentials and then into micro-credentials. While on the other side, we saw badging and certificates through to open badging and then overlapping into the micro-credential space. So there are some key characteristics, though, that in our particular context here in Australia, we see are necessary for any micro-credentials to be called a micro-credential. There needs to be some specificity about it. They would be very clear what we're learning. There's also flexibility in the way they're offered. They're usually in a digital format, but not always. We have, in Australia, we teach park rangers how to do things within Kakadu National Park, which is a famous national park here in Australia, and we teach them on country, the First Nations peoples. Usually micro-credentials are competency-based, and so that's important. And also, we've heard already this notion of stackability, and in many cases they are stackable. I'll talk about that a bit later. But very importantly, the whole notion of micro-credentials is driven by this desire for lifelong learning. And that's very important once we start to conceive where our micro-credentials come from. Let me just look at those few notions I just talked about then. Specificity. And that is about, unlike traditional degrees or traditional qualifications that cover a broad range of subjects, micro-credentials are designed to go in-depth into a focused bit of learning and experience. And so here is an example from RMIT where I used to work. The micro-credential might be in business analytics with using SQL and Python, specifically targeting the proficiency of a programming language or data analytics. So that would be for somebody who's been working in programming but wants to upskill in the notion of Python or SQL. And so importantly, it's targeted at that postgrad market. Here is a professional body, the Community of Early Learning Australia, and they are very keen on the notion of flexibility, as we all are, but they say micro-credentials are online, they're self-paced workshops that allow you to learn at your own pace and apply what you learned on the job straight away. And there is the key to micro-credentials, that you're getting knowledge that can be applied straight away. And of course that has a global audience. So unlike our traditional degrees that we have, don't necessarily have a broad they have a national audience mostly, but micro-credentials have an international audience. And we're seeing that increasingly because the different governments are starting to really discern what a micro-credential is. And so learners can complete these courses, of course, in their own pace and things like that. But it is aligned with the broader trend of online and remote learning. We then think about the digital nature of them. So unlike my degrees, my degrees don't have a digital certificate that goes with them. I have my testator that I can hang on the wall, but these digital formats allow me to share my credentials in other ways. So here's just a little screen grab from my LinkedIn website where I did a LinkedIn course on establishing credibility as a speaker. You can judge that later. We can look at, I did one for the ACO Learning Technologies Leadership Institute where I was a facilitator. I was awarded a badge for that. And I can display those badges on my LinkedIn site. I can display them on my e-portfolio or website. But what they do provide is a level of transparency to what I've studied. So a person can click on that link, you see where it says show credential, and they can go and see the validated piece of learning that's happened. They can't do that with our normal degrees. They can't click on the button and say that takes you off to the university website and it validates that Michael Sankey has done their degree. I can only do that through testimonials and things of that nature. Here's a micro-credential we offer at Charles Darwin University. It's the Foundations of Data Science, and it's a very popular micro-credential. And it's competency-based. That means that it's awarded based on the learner's ability to demonstrate a particular skill or knowledge. In this particular case, there's some assessments around data science. This model shifts the focus from the time spent in the classroom to the actual mastery of a particular subject matter, and that's demonstrated. Remember that kind of notion that it's very focused pieces of learning rather than a broad cases of learning which you would see in a degree. One of the previous speakers talked about the notion of stackability. Our Deakin University here in Australia were one of the first in Australia to think about stackability. Purdue University in the United States did as well, as did MIT, but Deakin here in Australia was the first one to think about stackable courses. That is, courses that are designed to be taken individually, but then add up towards a high level qualification. So I could do a whole lot of credentials in project management, for example, and build up towards a graduate certificate or something like that. So you would normally start, as you would with any qualification, at a basic level, but then work up and stack those badges and credentials up to earn that more fuller certificate. So here's an example from our university. So we've got a graduate certificate in higher education. Our graduate certificate is 80 credit points. So I got that wrong. That's supposed to say 40 credit points. Now, 10 credit points, you see on this bottom left-hand side, 10 credit points, each 10 credit equates to 150 hours of learning. So that's a normal unit of study for us. Our degree is 24 of those in Australia. So 10 credit points is 150 hours. Now, in our graduate certificate, we will normally have 4 courses, 4 units. And we would have an introductory unit, which is normally 10 credit points. We have a series of core courses, which would be 10 credit points. And we have a capstone unit, which is 10 credit points. And normally, in the old form, we would have another 10 credit point unit, and people would select which 10 credit point unit they wanted. In our particular case, we have a suite of micro-credentials. And we can take these 3, for example, scholarship of teaching and learning and practice, academic integrity and artificial intelligence, creating micro-credentials and short courses. You can take 3 out of the 5 or 6 we have, and there were different credit points, so 3, 3 and 4 would equal 10 credit points. And that goes towards the graduate certificate. Now we have developed those to be done as professional development within the university. So staff do not have to pay for them. So if you're a staff member at CDU, you don't have to pay for that micro-credential, and then you get that credited towards your graduate certificate in higher education. RMIT have a bit of a different model. Remember that's that university I worked at quite a few years ago. They started by working very closely with partnerships with industry. And on the right-hand side here, you see this gentleman, the short gentleman who was the Vice-Chancellor of RMIT. The person on the left was the president of a football club, an Australian rules football club. And they partnered together to offer the football players in their club and those associated with the club, we're talking thousands of people here, and offered them the opportunity to do RMIT micro-credentials. And so the football players particularly could start to develop up skills while they were still being football players, so that by the time they got out of being a football player, they had some qualifications. So Typically, if we're seeing this across other businesses, like telecommunication businesses, accounting firms, things like that, we'll be co-hosting webinars and promoting to have target markets for those micro-credentials. That could mean we can do targeted email campaigns, we can share things in newsletters and what micro-credentials might be upcoming and give early bird discounts and things like that. We can encourage our learners to display their badges in their online profiles and on the company websites and things. Importantly though, if we're working with a company, it's co-designing the content with that company and offering those joint webinars and things like that. Also importantly is attaining that industry validation for what you're doing. So it's not just the university offering the certificate to all and everybody, it is actually developing it, and you can develop a generic one and customize it for the different groups, but it's having that industry validation for that micro-credential that's really important. And so by partnering with industries who will endorse your micro-credentials, there's an extra level of credibility to your micro-credential. And that allows us to combine the resources and do the joint marketing and co-branding and things like that. Let's get back to lifelong learning. So micro-credentials promote the concept of lifelong learning, as I've already mentioned, and that's so that individuals can upskill. So the OECD is very strong in this notion of micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. They see that there's great future in globally, particularly in developing economies, to see micro-credentials used to upskill people. And this supports that idea that learning is not limited to a specific phase in your life, so the 3 or 4 years you're doing a degree, but it is actually an ongoing process of having to learn and be involved. So there are a whole range of benefits, and we've already heard a number of those today already. And understanding some of those benefits is essential to us moving forward as we develop our model of doing micro-credentials. And that's about enhancing skill development, it's about opportunities for continuous learning, it's about improving employability, and it's about showcasing our achievements and credentials. This is a micro-credential we offer, and it's called the Pedagogy of Indigenous Knowledges, Sharing Through Creative and Cultural Practice. Now, this micro-credential was developed in a partnership with the Australian government. So the government saw that it was necessary to co-design or to have a series of micro-credentials done at a national level. So it was designed at a specific target market. So in this particular case, we're talking about teachers in schools that want to know about the pedagogy of Indigenous knowledges. Now, our First Nations knowledges here are very important to us as a nation, but a lot of immigrants into Australia don't fully understand those Indigenous knowledges. So part of that is to help our teachers understand so they can then work with our students. And so it's assessing that tailored learning around needs and particularly matching personal and career goals, ensuring that our education is highly relevant to those professionals. It allows us to pace some of that learning, and so a person can feel as though they're participating in education but not have to do another whole degree. So they can pace their learning in mastering particular skills and moving on to the next particular skill and then building up those skills. And many of those are practical and hands-on, so students can apply that newly acquired skill in the workplace. And that's important, that they feel as though they can apply that skill straight away. Unlike a degree where they do 3 or 4 years of study and then they get an opportunity to apply those skills, micro-credentials are ideally suited for when you can apply those skills in the workforce while you're working. So it's a really powerful way to reinforce learning, to complement those more traditional forms of learning. So here's one I did, that was that one I did before that I showed you that I linked in my LinkedIn. It enabled micro-credentials to encourage, as I've already mentioned, that culture of lifelong learning. It allows you to evidence that learning in new ways that haven't been able to be done before, and it has dates associated with it. So that's very important in a sense, used by dates to some of the skills. And so that allows us to then offer refreshment courses and things like that. Because we know that knowledge is changing all the time, and certain knowledges go out of date fairly quickly. So, importantly, it's about helping us diversify those skills. I got a badge and a credential for being a CDU Academic Integrity Ambassador. And so I'm able to select where I show that. And so, ultimately, if I go for another job somewhere else, I might add that to my CV or to my website. I have a choice. Because micro-credentials are usually badged, you can select which badges you want to show in various places. You don't have to show the whole lot. You normally have what we call a backpack, and that backpack holds all our digital credentials, and we can choose to show those credentials where we want to. And that can give learners, it can give employees a competitive edge when they're looking in the job market. And so what we have seen is employers are now starting to recognise the value of these credentials, because many of their staff are doing these credentials and getting those specific skills that are being able to be used in the workplace straight away. And they can be used they can be strategically selected to align with particular elements in the workplace to provide career pathways and progression pathways. We do know, because the Gartner Institute did a major study on this just about 18 months ago, found the number of skills required for a single job increases by about 10% year on year. So there are new skills being required all the time. And so the degree I did 10 years ago, there are so many more skills that I might have learnt along the way in my job, but that traditional degree did not have all the skills that I needed now. And so we've seen that the micro-credentials are a way to upskill quickly and cheaply. We also know from that Gartner Institute report that 58% of the workforce will need new skills to do their job successfully in the future. So if I'm looking to move to a different work situation, there will quite likely be skills that I don't necessarily know for that. And so there are micro-credentials that I could do to prepare myself for that scenario. And so employers value this. They value the self-driven nature of employees who continually seek to enhance and add value to their skills, and in many cases they will pay for the micro-credentials for that particular person. Importantly, it's about also showcasing how and what we've done. I've already mentioned that I can choose where and how I showcase that. So it's important to showcase the micro-credentials for a number of reasons. One is to show that you are current and that you know your stuff now. It can be done through a standalone e-portfolio. I have an e-portfolio platform which I maintain for my academic purposes. On that platform there's also LinkedIn, of course, and I have a personal website as well. And so I can display my credentials alongside my more traditional qualifications, and it announces to everybody that I'm up to date. So it can help me customise my resume. If I was going for another job and I was in industry, I could focus that and provide a focus by the micro-credentials that I'm sharing in my online CV. And many CVs are moving into this online environment, and with LinkedIn sites and things like that. So employers are interested in that skills development, and it's a way of differentiating yourself as your peers. So a couple of examples. So for different professions, if I'm in education, if I was a teacher, I might want to do a micro-credential on enhancing my teaching or leadership skills. It might be around classroom management. It might be around curriculum development. It might be around the use of educational technology. If I was in business, it might be upskilling in terms of project management. It might be in relation to digital marketing or data analysis or leadership skills to advance my career. If I was, what about the scientist? Well, they could do a skill of proficiency in scientific techniques or some safety protocols. But what if I'm an historian? What would a micro-credential do for me then? Well, I could get a micro-credential in historical research or preservation or interpretation. There's a range of different things you could do because even in the field of history, people are starting to find new ways of doing things and new techniques for displaying that. Importantly, though, for an institution, you must have a policy and a procedure. So here is our policy, our micro-credential policy and procedure. So we outline the types of things that we're allowed to do. And the landscape around the policies and the regulatory frameworks are rapidly evolving in many countries, including the Commonwealth ones. And essentially they provide that level of quality and credibility to our programs, particularly for a university. This notion of quality is very important because that helps us market our programs. And let's have a look at what some of the other Commonwealth countries are doing in this regard. So in the UK, they have what's called characteristic statements around the micro-credentials, and they were developed in May 2022. And so their initiative came from the UK Quality Assurance Agency and collaborative enhancements projects that they had, and so they developed their characteristic statements. And they offered some funding for those institutions who have developed micro-credentials based on those characteristic statements. And these programs they're really designed to support the workforce, to upskill the workforce, and encouraging lifelong learning through these short, flexible courses. In Canada, the colleges and institutes group. Initially, Canada was quite dispersed. They have a range of, you might know in Canada, there's a French-speaking part of Canada, an English-speaking part of Canada, and so they have quite a diverse system. But they got together in 2021 and developed the status of micro-credentials, and now many of the provinces have come together and have agreed on the way in which micro-credentials should be offered. And so, and now they have a nice succinct definition of what a micro-credential is. In Malaysia, we have the guidelines for good practice in micro-credentials, and so they were developed fairly early, actually. They were one of the first countries to develop their practices and guidelines in their 2020 guidelines for good practice, and that allowed degrees to be unbundled and to be able to be stacked and things like that. In Australia, I worked with a number of people, and in November 2021 we developed the National Credentials Framework, National Micro-Credentials Framework, and that is aligned to what's called our Australian Qualifications Framework. So micro-credentials are part of our qualifications framework, so long as they're assessed. Remember I mentioned that they have to be assessed. But the micro-credential has to align itself with that AQF. It doesn't stand as a qualification in itself, so it's not a degree or a graduate diploma in itself, but it leads towards one, so it can be fitted within that, whether it's through that stack of emotion or through the concept of RPL, the recognition of prior learning. And so we developed that framework, and anybody in Australia, any institution in Australia needs to adhere to that framework who are going to call something a micro-credential. So that the Australian Qualifications Framework works across both higher education and vocational education, VET or TVET, and private providers also need to align to that framework. Now, based off that, we then developed a funding model. So the government supported a range of different groups to develop up micro-credentials similar to the UK government to get skills development up and going. So that you might remember that micro-credential I mentioned for First Nations knowledges on country in the arts. That was developed with government funding. And so, and they set some regulations around that, they allocated funding, and they encouraged institutions to design their micro-credentials to align with industry needs and standards. So they had to align with a skill, an industry skill, and developed up over a period of a year, and then were launched, and we've been running those micro-credentials now for a while. I'm just going to take you to a site that the federal government set up in Australia here called the Microcred Seeker, just to give you a sense of what's possible. So on this website here, you'll see this is where anybody in Australia, or anybody overseas in fact, could go and search for micro-credentials. They're offered through the platform. We see them here, education and training. There's ones in electricity, gas, water and waste management. There's forestry. Let's put in a search for like project management. Project management, okay. And it's going to give me a whole range of micro-credentials on project management offered by here the Australian Institute of Management, the University of Adelaide, Central Queensland University, Bond University, a whole range of different universities. And so you'll see here that they're online. It's 7 weeks, and for that 7 weeks it's going to cost you $3,370. Well, this one over here is 18 hours of work, and it's going to cost you $305. So that looks a bit better. I'm only going to pay $305 as opposed to $3,000. So let's go and have a look at this one. What's expected? Well, it's flexible, it's online, it's for a novice. It's going to be 18 hours of work, 3 hours of work a week. There's the price, and then the syllabus. It's got some core knowledge, some essential communication skills, and an understanding of what's in practice today. And so it then tells us what the assessment is, and then what credits I'll get towards if I want to stack that. It tells me who the instructors are and the flexible start dates and things like that. So there's an interesting way of, and there are thousands of these micro-credentials offered through this site. Going back to this, there are other ways in which we can do it in Australia too. So the New South Wales government, New South Wales is the largest state in Australia population-wise. They have an Institute of Applied Technology, and they too offer micro-credentials as an alternate way. They also offer these through that portal, but they have their own portal as well, which is a bit cheeky, but they do, and it's here are the types of micro-credentials they can get on that. So there's cyber breach simulations, there's cyber government and cyber planning. All these micro-credentials you can do, and there's a cost, of course, associated with those. Looks like most of those are $360 for about 48 hours to 80 hours of work. I've mentioned this notion of quality assurance, and that's very important because we need to think about, one, the credibility of our micro-credential. We need to think about the transferability of our micro-credential. We need to think about the consistency of our offerings, and particularly around consumer protection. So what's become clear over recent years is that because micro-credentials are involved in such a way, the market's becoming more discerning, and they're looking for this notion of a quality assured product. And so, and for those following reasons. So credibility is really important, of course, is why we have our policy and ensures our micro-credentials meet rigorous standards. We are accredited for recognised bodies to validate those programs. So if I'm doing one in engineering, I'd want Engineers Australia to validate that micro-credential. In Australia, the accreditation of micro-credentials needs to comply, as I mentioned, with that AQF and the micro-credentials framework. So there's an extra level of protection there. And then the institution needs to have their own policies and procedures in place, as we do. Because we have a quality assurance agency called TEXA, the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency, and they come knocking on the door and they say, is your micro-credential meet these different levels? And we can say, yes, here's the policy, here's how we quality assure our products, and here's the professional accreditation that goes with that. And so that level of alignment ensures a really good level of credibility for our learners. Part of that is consistency of our products. Just like any other courses we offer, there needs to be consistency when you go from course to course to course. And so in terms of micro-credentials, there's of course a global market for micro-credentials. And so we want to see some consistency in the way micro-credentials are also offered. So the Europeans very wisely developed some guidelines for how to design, to issue and recognise micro-credentials. And many of us will adhere to those different principles. And so our policies and procedures need to be backed up with these good design practices. And so that European Training Foundation did develop this guide for us, and it contains a really handy checklist. So it's worthwhile grabbing hold of that guide and going through the checklist when you are developing your micro-credentials. And again, that helps maintain that level of credibility moving forward for your micro-credentials. Really, so that our learners can receive a really good experience. The notion of transferability is increasingly being discussed across the national levels. So if I get a micro-credential in Australia, what is that worth in India? What's that worth in the United States? What's that worth in the UK? Is it the same value? And so just as the globe, as the global industry higher education had the Bologna Agreement around professional levels, similarly we're getting to that point where our national frameworks need to be aligned. So we've all now developed our national frameworks. They don't all perfectly align yet. So there is some work still to do in relation to pulling those together and the recognition of micro-credentials across nations. Micro-credentials, of course, pitch at many different levels. At the undergraduate level, the postgraduate level, and just for lifelong learners. However, they are mostly linked with institutions and credit transfer. To do that, we need to have those frameworks in place. We do know already that the major market for micro-credentials is postgraduate. Not that many undergraduates do them. We give our undergraduates lots of badges, but not necessarily micro-credentials, because it's not, you can use them as part of a degree, but you really are sabotaging your own degree if you're using within a degree. You need to use them mostly for the postgrad market. Badge away to your heart's content. But in terms of a micro-credential, you need to be able to focus them on the postgrad market and the lifelong learning market. Well, that's what we've found over the last few years of having offered these out. So that does, of course, provide a level of surety for our employers if we are focusing on them and their accreditation. And so, importantly, though, there's some details they need to know. So the level of learning, the amount of time that's been spent learning, and clearly defining the learning outcomes, as one of our previous speakers said. It's really important to define those learning outcomes and to assure that those learning outcomes have been formally assessed. Otherwise, we can't say we actually learned that material. So the credibility of micro-credentials is based on the fact that that person has done some assessment to validate that they have done that learning. And that helps with us thinking through consumer protection and the quality assurance mechanisms we want to put in place, because we don't want subpar programs. The learners themselves need to be confident that the micro-credentials meet certain educational standards, and so we try very hard to do that, particularly for registered training providers. So there's a number of, there might be 40 universities in Australia, but there are hundreds of private training providers. And so there needs to be a level of quality assurance for them, and that at Quality Agency, TEX I mentioned before, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, offers that. So universities in Australia are self-accrediting, so we have the right to accredit our own programs. Private providers do not. They have to be accredited by our Tertiary Education Quality Agency. But Wang said last year that it's a real important part of the bigger ecosystem micro-credentials form. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that look, we've really seen this evolution of micro-credentials becoming a prominent feature of what we would see as our contemporary education and professional development schema here in Australia. And our digital economy is evolving towards micro-credentials more and more, particularly around the meaning and acquiring and demonstrating skills and knowledge, those new skills, and keeping our employees to make us a more productive nation. And so quality assurance and accreditation is paramount to that, because people don't want to waste their time studying micro-credentials that are not accredited or don't lead to something else. So students can leverage these credentials to acquire specific career skills and to help identify, it's part of our job as our institutions, as our universities, to provide pathways for these students to know that if they're going to do this, they're going to get that, and this is going to help them become better professionals. It's about helping them to showcase those achievements through the allocation of badges and certificates and things. And it's about doing this in partnership with employers to help their professions grow as well. So I think that's really what I want to share, and am open to questions, though it is apparently quite hard to hear. So I'm going to stop sharing now and come back to myself on the screen.
Professor Mike, we typing the
Okay, let's have a look. Yes. In my credential design and development perspectives, I'm curious about e-learning seating time versus learning hours in micro-credentials. Okay, so I mentioned before that when we design our micro-credentials, they're designed a full, if I was doing a full unit of study, which is that 10 credit points, it's based on 150 hours of work. So if I'm saying my micro-credential is worth 3 credit points or 4 credit points, I'm going to be doing between 40 to 50 hours of work for that micro-credential. And so that is a combination of listening to lectures, reading materials online, and doing assessments. And just like we design our normal courses to do that, we do that with micro-credentials as well. But we're really being quite explicit. With our micro-credentials, we don't want that there's less learning outcomes we have to deal with. So we're probably only dealing with 3 to 4 learning outcomes as opposed to 6 or 7 learning outcomes per course. So that makes it easier to align. But there is this notion of read, listen, self-test. Read, listen, self-test that leads towards the creation of something to help that learner demonstrate the skills. So it's not just about quizzes, because we know in the age of generative AI that quizzes are really easy to cheat. So we don't want that to be the case, but it might be the development of a learning plan. It might be the development or some we might do some peer assessment and things like that as well. So we are conscious that in the age of generative AI, things are changing quite a bit, and so we're moving away from things like quizzes for summative purposes. We're using quizzes for formative purposes to help learners understand the information, to process information, but in terms of summative, we're using other forms of assessment. So I hope that helped in terms of the amount of hours, and do the impact of the design delivery, and do they impact the, yes, they do impact the design, because we are talking only of a portion, we're talking about specific pieces of knowledge, not a whole 150 hours of work here. We're talking about 30 hours. So it might be that in our normal courses we might deal with 3 or 4 topics, in some cases more, we're dealing with one topic. And so it helps us focus, to provide that extra level of focus on that one topic. So those best practice and guidelines are found in that European document that I shared before. And that's probably one of the better ones I've seen in terms of the checklists that you would consider moving forward. Number 2 there, impact of progress of AI on designing. Okay, so yes. So we're seeing a number of our learning management systems increasingly incorporating AI technologies into those learning management platforms, and a number of the tools associated with learning management platforms also now have AI embedded in them. And so we're seeing that it is something we want to help students come to terms with. We know from PricewaterhouseCoopers, a major accounting firm in the United States, they did a study of industry in the United States. We know that 74% of industry are using artificial intelligence and are using it in their businesses on a regular basis. So in preparing our learners, we need to prepare them for this notion that they are entering an AI-enhanced world. And so we need to be encouraging them in the use of AI, but in ways that is not doing the work for them, but engaging with it to help them come to the learn. And that's why the reworking of assessment is really important. So not essays, not quizzes, but much more practice-based, much more reflective, being able to demonstrate particular skills. If you are going to do an exam or something like that to test the skills, it has to be invigilated. Otherwise, we don't know that those students, gone are the days of uninvigilated online open book exams. We just can't do those anymore because it's so easy to cheat. And so it does mean that we're changing the way in which we assess. There should be any possibilities to collaborate with your institution, Australian universities, for developing micro-credentials. Yeah, well, we are I'm just completing some work with the Commonwealth of Learning as we speak, actually. We've created a micro-credential on developing micro-credentials, and I'm one of the readers of that course. And so that will be released fairly soon. I'm not sure when of the date that is being released. But in that course, we've worked through some of the information I've shared today, which is really coming out of our module 1. We've got 5 modules, development of, and 2 of those modules are around designing and developing micro-credentials. Then we have a module about quality assurance and marketing and micro-credentials, and then we have a future, what's happening in the future type scenario. So we'll be able to release that fairly soon, I'm hoping. All the videos are made, all the quizzes are done, we're just polishing that off at the moment. So very happy for people to be involved in that. It's a micro-credential on micro-credentials. Wonderful. So I think that's all the questions I have there, unless there's other questions that I might have missed. You can see here the sun's going down now, so it's late afternoon here. It's about 5:30 in the afternoon, so the sun's coming down through the window. is there a minimum or maximum duration? Yeah?
Thank you so much for joining us and gave us a insight on microcephaly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Break for lunch. All our resources are in the banner and start for the meeting. So we have a photo. Break for lunch.